everybody, and welcome to the Tabletop Worldbuilding 101 panel hosted by Kobold Press. Thank you all so much for spending your Sunday at PAX Unplugged with us. It's so nice to see you all out there. Yeah, I see some thumbs up. I'm Dot. I'll be your moderator for this panel, but I am very excited to welcome this incredible group of people to the stage. They have a ton of background in world building for tabletops, and I think the best thing we can do is let you introduce yourself. So we'll go down the line, starting with Daisy.
All right, well, I'm the girl of the hour, the girl with the power, the hit maker, the record breaker, the greatest attraction in games today. I'm Daisy Darling. I work on games, and take it away.
Why do I have to follow that? That's not okay. How dare you, Daisy? My name is Amanda Hamon. I'm a senior designer at Wizards of the Coast. I've been there for about a year, and my first project was actually released earlier this week. Strixhaven, A Curriculum of Chaos is out and around, and super excited. I hope you guys love it. If you don't, you can go away. But yeah, I've been around. I've been a game designer for quite a number of years, working for Kobold Press and Paizo before that, and lots of different things. So y'all can't get rid of me.
My name is Josh. I'm a whole bunch of things. I'm on staff with Jasper's Game Day. I'm a freelance tabletop game designer. I do a lot of performing on streams, podcasts, etc. Yeah. Follow me on the internet at Joshua M. Simons.
And yes, please.
Yes.
I'm Eugenio Vargas. I'm DM Jazzy Hands on the internet. I'm a Twitch streamer, game designer, and narrative writer, freelancer for Wizards of the Coast and Green Ronin and a couple of other groups. I am the storyteller on Into the Motherlands, which is a new sci-fi property, so that's some world building, thank you. That's some world building we'll talk about today. And I'm also a podcaster. I have a now 4.5-year-old actual play D&D podcast, also in a homebrew world. So that's me.
All right. So as you can see, we have some serious names up here with lots of background from a variety of aspects of how we and you build worlds for your tables. So I think we have to start with the basic question, which is, what is world building? What is it to do setting design for tabletop? How would you define it?
I think if I was to break it down very easily at like a fundamental level, the setting is the fictional play space in games, if we're talking about games specifically, but it could also be novels, books, movies, a convention. And if I was to break it down into maybe 3 very simple components, and there are many other components we can talk about, is location, characters, and maybe a conflict. For example, we're in a location, a convention center. Characters, there's many personalities up on the stage. Conflict, you can look at my Twitter timeline. And, but interested in other thoughts, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, as Daisy put it so succinctly, the setting, the world is the place where your game is taking place, and that's really where you start from. You start with, what do you need the game to evoke to your players? How do you need your players to be able to interact with specific elements that are taking part in the game, and you build out from there. And so that might mean that your campaign setting as a homebrew DM, for example, is as small as the NPCs that the characters are interacting with, and the places along the road that they're going, the town that they're based in, the outskirts of the town, and the monsters that tend to lurk there. That is entirely acceptable. You don't have to do the giant thing. But of course, some people do, and that is also acceptable. Going from the outside in is a totally valid approach if that's something you want to do.
Yeah. Hey, that's all I need to contribute. Good job. I think every story, the context that story takes place in really impacts the content of that story. Because you can take the exact same storyline, for instance, like Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, which we've seen played out in various different circumstances across various different forms of media. And the context that takes place in changes so much about what actually happens in the story, the details about the characters. So I really think of it more than anything is what's happening to inform specifically what's significant about this story that we're telling.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add that particularly Amanda and Josh have already touched on is that the world building is more than the name of the city that you're in and the NPCs, right? You do have to, well, you don't have to do what you want, but I would recommend that you also think about the tone and the style that you are implying based on your setting. It's one of the many ways that you can really sort of give your table the heads up about what kind of game it is you're running, what kind of story it is that you're telling. There's so much about a world. If it's set, something set in a rainforest is going to already, just immediately with that one word, have a very different tone and style of game than something set in a city, right? So those are other things that maybe aren't the brick and mortar things that we think about in world building, but are just as important in my little humble opinion.
Well, I think that actually inspires my next question, which is where do you all start? When you're starting to build a new world, where do you begin? Because that's a daunting task to be like I'm going to make a brand new world. So where does it start?
For me, I mean, the sort of going very easy advice, right, is to start small and build out, right? I think a lot of us have either heard or given that advice, myself included. And that is true, right? You don't want to feel like you have to build the entire world when all your story needs right now is the town. But I actually start with the reason that I'm creating this homebrew world in the first place. There are so many existing worlds for all different styles of games, for all different types of stories you want to tell. So if you're going to build your own, awesome, but I start with why. What is it that isn't served in the existing settings that I have at my disposal that I want to have available in this setting?
And I'll jump in too. And I think for me, what it is it starts with something that inspires. It could be a song. It could be a piece of artwork. It could be a slogan. It could be a word you hear someone say on the street that's just strikes you to your core. And what I start to do is I start to collect these things and I start to piece and composite them together. This is a very loose way to do it. And then I usually sit on that for about a year, and then I end up with a thesis for a game setting where I can break it down into cosmology and geography and politics and technology. It's one of those things, but I think it starts with inspiration. I get inspired to create.
By like a single thing, and it just like sparks the bigger flame. That's cool.
And sometimes the inspiration's a deadline.
Look, that's fair.
I think that's a very, very good point, Daisy. I think like starting with that inspiration and thinking about what is it that interests you? What are you really passionate about? Like, what are you excited to do something new with? And a lot of times that breaks down into genre or subgenre, right? So there have been times where I've been like, oh, I really want to come up with like a Weird West game. I really want to play a Weird West game, or I really want to play something, that's high fantasy or science fantasy or something like that. And thinking about what makes the elements of those types of stories and kind of sketching out some of those broad things, science fantasy, I want it to be space opera and have lots of worlds, and I want there to be lots of different cultures that have evolved from certain seeds of things and that maybe even exist in the real world, and just have those vague things out there and then go, okay, I've got my larger framework, now I'm going to tell my specific story, and I'm going to start out with what station are the players at, and what is going to be the quest lines, and what do I need to know, what do they need to know about where to go and how things work, and then just kind of go from there. Then just building along that line of that story, will help you fill in those blanks once you've got that larger framework.
Absolutely. And I think, so I tend to be very pragmatic in everything that I do when it comes to writing stuff. So I always ask the question, who is this for, right? If I'm running a homebrew campaign for a group of players at home, I'm going to ask them, what kind of story do we want to tell? What do you want to explore in terms of theme and tone as we get into it? If I'm writing something, then that's going to be different because I don't have a specific group of players to ask. So then I have to go and talk to people that I know are into that sort of game. I might be like, hey, Eugenio, we're going to do a sci-fi game. I know you're a big sci-fi fan.
Yeah, not so much.
Talk to me about what would be compelling to you about a setting like this.
Well, we definitely can't leave the planet.
Okay, that's fine.
So that actually, once again, a really nice segue, which is what is the balance between, a new world setting that you're all playing in? What is the balance between the GM to player contribution? How do you use your players for inspiration, I imagine?
Some games, that's a built-in core mechanic. For example, in the game Invisible Sun, in your first session, you work with the players to put together aspects of the neighborhood, the NPCs that live there. And you go around and everyone gets to add and sort of composite their neighborhood in the houses they all live in, and it creates an investment in the world. It varies from system to system, and I kind of like to do a mix and match, whether it's codified in the rules or find out what would interest them. This sort of fictional weaving, if it's something the players are really into and it energizes and helps the campaign or series of games, campaigns being a military term that doesn't always apply, if it helps the game persist, that's when I use it.
Yeah, that's a really great way to measure that.
I think that one of the really sneaky tools that you have in your toolbox as a DM who's running an entirely homebrew campaign is listening to your players and paying attention to how they're interacting with the world and what they're saying even out of character and the way that they're discussing things that they're interacting with and encountering, that their characters are encountering in the game. And you can really absorb that, and you can kind of turn that on its head in some cases to surprise them, or you can actually feed into that, and sometimes that might even influence the story. You watch your players exploring, these dark alleyways that you've put in front of them, and that's, a whole part of your city, and you've got an idea of kind of what's going on there, and somebody makes a joke about, oh, that looks like a murder alley over there, right? And then you're like, oh, yeah, that's hilarious. No, I don't think that's true. And then it turns out there literally is a serial killer that's been running around and has murdered somebody in that alley. That's somewhat of a dense example, but that's a good way of absorbing and having players drive the creation of the world without actually being aware of the fact that they are. And I think that's a very
Take some pressure off
useful
the
thing.
GM too, right?
Yeah,
a little
right?
pressure off
Yeah,
of
and
you
it
to have
makes
to
you-
do everything.
It makes you look so smart, and really it's just like, y'all did this for me, but okay.
I think actually to that point, there's also a lot of value, and if the players really think something is going to happen, sometimes I'll throw out my plan to do that so that they can feel the satisfaction of having, one, contributed to the world, and two, very simply, I can make them feel like they have got a good read on what's going on. I think it's important to remember that in any game, there's value in going with where the story is going, and if that's something that your players are invested in, then I oftentimes will lean into that in order to help them enjoy the story more.
I don't have a ton more to add to these brilliant minds. I just have to tell on my podcast cast a little about this very issue. There are things that you can absolutely say with your players, no, that isn't in fact correct, right? You want to have a good reason for all of the reasons that these folks have enumerated, right? Players will have buy-in if they can contribute to the world, all of these things. You can say no, it's good to have a good reason. So for example, random encounters, if you play with those, are often a source of weird world building from your players. My crew on the podcast was sort of traveling, right? We love our travel episodes, and I use random encounters, or have been using those random encounters to just build the sort of background of the world, right? The types of creatures that they encounter just inform sort of the tone of the setting. So they're traveling, and they run across a well. And I had pulled from a couple of different sort of random encounter tables. Sly Flourish has a thing about sort of enhancing random encounters, and I put it all together, and I guess it was more interesting than I ever could have imagined, because now, 6 seasons later, the cast is still convinced that the crux of the whole campaign is this well, and no matter how much I try to say that in fact it was just a well. But that's been such a fun thing. Even me saying, no, it isn't, right, has still been such a fun little storytelling seed for us, because now it's a joke, right? The players really want to go back, and for whatever reason in our story, the elements just conspire to keep them from it, right? So even if you have to say no to a player's idea about contributing to the world, that can still be world and story building for you.
Nice. Love that. Yeah. Now, you had mentioned you use random encounters, so I think I want to talk about when is it best to make it and when is it best to use what somebody else has made, right? Because there is a lot of work that goes into building something from scratch. What is the balance there of pulling from outside inspiration and coming up with really new raw content?
I think it kind of comes back to a couple answers earlier. I'd say audience. You might run someone else's work or borrow, be inspired, and pay tribute to because it's familiar with players, or it's something that's very exciting. I play a lot of people are very familiar with Magic, so a setting like Strixhaven or Theros, it resonates with them. and then when it comes down to make it, I always think about how much time do I have, and then how deep can I go, and maybe this is just going to be the first pass on the canvas, and we'll add other coats of paint later. But if it's for publication or something I'd like to publish through an outlet, then I set myself a timetable.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. I think it's this balance between two things. One, which is very practical, which is how much time do you have and what can you invest in what it is you're creating, and also how invested are you in wanting to create your own story? What stories do you have to tell? What new things do you want to try out creatively? And kind of putting those two together and seeing what you come up with. And I think like every option is always on the table, right? And I think a lot of folks sort of have this thought of, well, if I don't run something out of a book exactly the way that it's in the book, then I'm doing it wrong and I'm doing a disservice to the game, or I'm disrespecting it. And I think pretty much every creator up here can say, we don't think that. Like, we absolutely want you to make the game your own.
Can I give a really quick aside?
Sure.
In my setting, Grimworld, which you can pick up at 2C Gaming's booth if it's there yet, I make a statement about authorship at the front of the book, where I say, you know, I wrote this, then handed it to an editor who ran it by the CEO of the company, and you know, and then it's going to be passed to a dungeon master, a game master, and then players are going to touch this world. We're all authors. Authorship is shared because it's a game. I wrote a book, and that's the core of the setting, but then there is no canon. I leave it to the people to collaborate with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I mean, I do that myself. One of the most recent games that I ran was something because I knew I was doing it on virtual tabletop during the pandemic. I knew I needed to have some kind of base to fall back on, like I needed there to be maps, and I needed sort of the framework of the adventure. And it was a published adventure that was a pirate adventure, right? And it was 6 modules all running together. But I went, I want to do my own version of the story. And so I overlaid a homebrew campaign over it and made it like a Hellforge conspiracy that was overlaid over all of the pirate shenanigans. And it ended up being probably about 75% homebrew toward the end, especially as the story kind of went off, you know, in its own direction. But that, you know, that is entirely valid. You can do any combination of an entirely new thing, an entirely out of the book thing. It's really what makes you excited as a DM, because you know you're the one who should be enjoying yourself, right? It's not just all about the players. It's your own enjoyment.
Yeah. So I have a home game that I've been doing for maybe 3 years now, and it started off as just Lost Mine of Phandelver. I was teaching some new players Dungeons and Dragons for the very first time. And so it started off very much like, cool, hey, let's do the module. But as we were going along, I took bits and pieces from their backstories, sprinkled a little bit in here and there. And now here we are 3 years later. We have not touched anything official in terms of adventure in probably 2 years, because we just branched out. We followed this storyline from that character's backstory, and there wasn't really a town in that world that had been fleshed out that fit what I was looking for, so I just wrote it myself, and we went there. And then I wanted to throw in a little island kingdom because we needed to go across the seas for something, and so we just went there, and I just fleshed out what I needed to. I like to use anything that's published as a guide and then just kind of tweak as I need to in order to get where I'm trying to go.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, I mean, insofar as we're really actually concerned about establishing what is, and I guess isn't, although what I'm about to say means that it doesn't matter, what is world building, right? You could use a completely established setting, and every time you play, you are still world building, right? Because your table's version of that world is not going to be like anyone else's. And you are still, as the GM, you are still deciding what to present to your players, what parts of the world, established or otherwise, that you're presenting to your players, and they're responding to it in a very unique way. So every time you play, established setting or homebrew, you are world building. The other thing I want to say that I will never forget, real early on in my podcast, I was real concerned about making sure that we didn't step on any toes, we wanted this to be a homebrew campaign. And we came to a point where we needed a map, and I was like, I'm not a cartographer. I don't want to make a map. And I will never forget, I was talking actually to Dan Dillon, who is another designer at Wizards of the Coast, and I said, I don't know what to do. I kind of want to use this from this other module, and he said a thing to me that I will never ever forget, which is if the players get to use classes and races and subclasses and spells that are in a book, in a homebrew campaign, why can't the DM still call themselves a homebrewer, but use pieces of established, published, whatever? And that's absolutely 100% correct, and I've never forgotten, I've never let go of it, because you are world building. If you are running Out of the Abyss in the Underdark exactly as presented in Out of the Abyss, which is a D&D module. Sorry, I know this is not a D&D panel, this is a general world building panel, but you are still world building that version of the Underdark. So don't ever feel like you are sewn in one way or the other. A combination is always at your disposal, and whatever is most helpful for you and your table and your story, use it, and don't feel bad about using it.
Great. So I think that leads to the question of like, well, what tools do you use? You know, note taking can be a daunting task for those of us with like extreme ADHD, you know, those kinds of things. So what does your process look like for writing your notes? Do you go the World Bible route, or are you more of a bullet list kind of a person? What are the things you use to you know, put your world down?
Okay, if I'm creating a world, I do 8 steps, and I don't think I'll say all of them here because I might forget 1 or 2. There's a video of me on YouTube where I break it down. Just skip to the last 10 seconds, they're all listed. But essentially, I start with basic geography, and then what is the political structure? What kind of is the tech level? For example, if it's snowy mountains, people might travel through skis because they can travel more quickly.
Right, okay.
Or an animal helps move them. I think of the cosmology, and is it local, like a Miyazaki film where gods walk among the people, or is it unknown? No one knows who or what the gods are. I think about the ecology, both flora and fauna, the monsters and things like that could be in the area. And then I think about the people, the factions, and how do they interact with each other? And so that's sort of at a high level. And then I'd also say the demeanor or disposition of the setting. You know, the world is cruel. There might just be a word or a phrase that I put down. The world is cruel. That's it. That's how I know this is going to be a harsh setting. Or it might be hope is still alive, or something like that. Hope is still alive, you know. My book was described. They said, you came up with a new genre. I said, what's that? They said, well, someone said this was a grim dark book, but this is grim bright. This is filled with so much hope. And I was, so, you know, it's little things like that. So I kind of just go down the 8 steps, and by the end of it, you have about 25,000 words, which is roughly a chapter.
Yeah, right. So, okay, so you have the kind of a nice structure of all the things you like to hit. Love that, yeah.
Yeah, I start there.
Yeah, I'm really lazy. So I have a bit of a different approach, which largely is driven by the game. And that's, again, very much just like I've got a certain amount of time to prepare the session. And so I spend some time before I actually get into the mechanics of the game that I'm preparing, thinking about what are the possible directions that the players might go, and what am I going to need to come back with their questions with answers? How am I going to make sure that they are getting what they need to be able to move the story forward, and how am I going to make sure that they have as much of an array of choice as possible, and that feels like a real and breathing world. So, like I described earlier, I definitely do, what Daisy said. I list out all of the larger structure and the scaffold of how the world works. But when I'm preparing for that session and I'm doing that nitty-gritty world building, I'll think, okay, right, what's the specific situation that the session is starting out in? Where are they at? What's happened before? What are their goals from what I've been able to tell from their table talk? And where might they go from here? They might go to, try to track down the city guard. Well, how does the city guard work? Who's in charge of the city guard? Who's somebody who, might be a surprise to come offer more information, or who's somebody who might have, who might betray them and might have nefarious purposes? What's like a shop that they might need to go to? What's an organization that they might want to proffer a deal with? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
And having that all feel like that exists before they make those choices has really helped me out, because, there's absolutely the times where people go, oh, I'm going to go talk to that shady-looking guy over in the corner, and you've only described him as part of scene setting, not thought at all about what his name is, and I've absolutely had to be like, that's Barnabas over there, and he's just the town drunk, and he's over there, he's mumbling about, complaining about the soup or something. that works as well, but I'm trying to be as prepared as possible so that I'm not just, coming up with everything on the fly, because that's a lot of work. That's hard.
Yeah.
I don't know, Google Docs, I guess.
I mean, that is a really good answer.
I am sort of more to the Amanda school of thought in that a lot of it is sort of individual session based. But one of the things that I have found is great about the Google Docs is that not only can I sort of have things separate and labeled in a digital space where they're pretty easy to access, I can also give access to those documents to the different people who might also have things to put on them. So sometimes that might mean players. I am super, super lucky, particularly for the podcast, in that I have a friend that works with me as my story consultant. So we're able to sort of plan together. So he's got access to those documents and can write notes for things that happen in an episode that I certainly didn't clock in the moment, but that are important to the world. So, use whatever is best for you. My point is sort of use also the people that are around to help you with it. Your players are going to know what's important to them, so they'll remember the important things for their story. That's awesome. If you don't have, my writing partner is my story consultant for the podcast, but like that could just be a friend that you like to tell about your sessions after the Friday night game every week. Whatever it is, just use the people around you. Because it's a collaborative storytelling game. We're all doing it, and yes, you are the narrator, but everyone participates in that process.
Yeah, I feel like I would really like to be a very organized DM with all of these notes and a document about every city. And I always start a campaign with that intention, and then it immediately falls apart. But
Laid plans, right?
Yeah.
look, that is so true. But I do ascribe to the Google method as well. I actually have a drive with specifically just campaign notes, and so I'll have a document. I've actually got a running document with just 3 pages of here's some story hooks that I think I could use at some point. Here's just a list of NPC names because sometimes I'm really bad at improvising them on the fly. And so when I'm running a game, I'll often just have my phone there and just, oh, hey, I need a name really quick, scroll. Oh yeah, this is Jeremiah. Anyways, here's what you know about Jeremiah. Because I think going back to that point that I think you had mentioned at the top of the panel about how sometimes less is more, that doesn't mean that you don't prepare stuff and have a lot of ideas booked. It just means that maybe you wait to see where exactly it's going to fit best and apply it when you need it, rather than have this whole built-out city right here and then the players take a hard right. And you never get to the city that you've built out. You can just move all that information to where it needs to be.
Going to that point of making it look like you have your stuff together as the DM when you probably don't, there's a wonderful tool out there called Anvil that some of you might be familiar with. I see some thumbs up.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
A lot of people, yeah.
Yeah, Anvil is fantastic for being a repository of different types of information, and it lays out a lot of the basic building blocks of a world and allows you to kind of organize your notes. And I've played in a campaign where the DM has used that, and it's been really great as a player to be like, oh, what's the name of the main religious organization? We don't remember the way the church is kind of structured. And you can go back and look at that because that's information that he's given us in the game, and it's stored right there. So
That's a great
Google
tool.
Docs, various tools, right?
It sounds like even some templated type things. I imagine if you start in the same place every time, it's easy to kind of build that for yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
All right, we are about halfway through the panel, which means we are going to begin taking questions. So we have a mic here in the center aisle. Please line up, maintain social distancing 6 feet. Please don't touch the mic. And we're going to stick to single, no 2-part questions for today, just because I have a feeling there are going to be a lot of questions and we want to get through as many as possible. So looks like we have somebody already up, so I'll just let you jump right in.
Yep. So my question is about, to some extent, getting your campaign to not wander too much throughout the world that you have built. I love using things like random trinkets and adding to the story twists around that. And the first time I did that, after a year and a half and players wandering around, and I had a blast adding depth to the world and showing it to them, it kind of petered out because there was too much wandering around. So my question is, what can you do to keep things engaging, not just for yourself, but also for your players? For example, this time I said, the first arc is going to be 6 to 8 sessions and committing to that. and then it's helping, but I would like to hear
Yeah.
other
So
ideas.
how to keep it engaging for the
Yeah.
players? Yeah.
All right, so I think, yeah, this is a question about engagement, which is about play facilitation and moving. And there's a really good book by Robin Laws called Hamlet's Hit Points, which is all about the concept of persistence. And when I gave my first answer, I talked about how can I help play persist. I would look at pacing, beats, and essentially what I would probably suggest is maybe make what we could call a spine for your session. The spine is essentially, these are when you need to make sure you hit certain beats, keep track of time, as well as assess energy. You might need to ask people how they're feeling, because someone like me, I have a resting daisy face. PG-13. Essentially, I would recommend that you think about pacing, different story beats, and when to drop them. And I recommend Hamlet's Hit Points because he analyzes like 5 popular stories, ties it into games, and then suggests, not that you have to prescribe, and he gives all sorts of ins and outs, variations, and how to drop it. But that might help with the persistence where you can keep people getting engaged.
Great.
Yeah, I think that pacing bit that you mentioned and plot points with the spine, that's really wise. That's a great way to achieve what it is you're asking about. Having a really good outline of the plot of the session is, I think, speaking to that is going to also help keep it engagement, where we have all played sessions where players have, gone on a tangent, or sometimes they're, disengaged and they're not even talking in character about what's going on. And paying attention to their faces and what the engagement at the table is like is the perfect way for you to realize, oh shoot, now something needs to happen. And so, that's when you go to your outline and you look at the plot point and you drop something that happens. You see that a lot in the adventure in the Strixhaven book. It's about an entire school year. Each adventure is an entire school year, and there's a lot of open-ended things that you can do and explorations that can happen, and like little quests that you can go on, but that aren't constrained by time. And then there are specific events that happen at each point in the year because this is now happening on campus, and that's very much meant to have the players be like, okay, the thing that you're doing, that's not that important right now because now there's an improv festival happening right in front of you and you've gotten pulled onto the stage and you've got to pretend to be an elephant.
Yeah, I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next question.
Y'all were talking a little bit before about making sure that you're devoting, the time that you have to actually writing and fleshing out the world. My question is how to strike a balance between creating a rich world that feels amazing and making yourself crazy by wanting to make the most authentic possible version of it / the most oh my god, look at all these details that they're coinciding. If you look at a world like, I don't know, like Avatar The Last Airbender, where you see look at all these different the air nomads are correlating to this and the earth is correlating to this.
Yeah.
So you want to strike the balance between driving yourself crazy and actually getting something out there and complete.
Yeah. So how to make it rich and compelling without burning out really on the word.
This is probably not for everyone, for what it's worth. Of course, none of our advice is. But for me, I have found that actually you can accomplish that without having it all ready at the beginning. It is okay to, because that connection, your example, right, about the air nomads and things that they are connected to, right?
Yeah.
When the show first introduced the air nomads, one of two things happened, and it's been a while since I watched, so I don't remember which it is. But either they introduced that connection right away because they did some sort of narrative lore dump, or we didn't find out about that connection until much later. And so in your games, in your stories, in your worlds, that you can do that. You can know that you want this to be significant in some way, whatever you're introducing. But maybe the way that it's significant, the way it connects to things, comes out in the story. Maybe your players are going to help you, remind you of that. Maybe, or maybe you have to, see what other things happen before you can really make that connection. I think it is possible to be super rich and specific over time. Because the other thing is, if you plan it all at the beginning, then you have this all of us, you know, no matter how much we would like to say that we give the power to the players, right? There is some level of like, I want you to see this cool thing that I did, right? And so if we do that all ahead of time, it's much harder for us as the narrators, as the GMs, or as the DMs to, you know, practice what we preach and let them, you know, if they're really not going to find out that thing, we have to let them not find out that thing. If you don't have that thing yet, it's way easier.
A piece of advice I like to give too is I design things that I know my players are going to touch or sense through one of the 5 senses. And if there's an extra bit of rich detail, I might suggest to another player at the table or ask a question and say, and you know this contextual piece of this, you know why the hilt of this sword has that specific colored gem. You know, your family, you know, your father had a similar one, you're part of the same order. And I find ways, but I start and I only put the effort into things that I know that people are going to sense through one of the 5 senses in a play session. Or I have to, since I design games too, I have to hypothesize what will be interesting to touch.
Another good option can be if you're finding yourself with lots of scattered elements that players have uncovered that you necessarily at the beginning didn't intend to be connected, you can always rework what you're thinking. And the players don't know that you didn't intend for those 2 things to relate to each other. They don't know that you came up with this idea and this other idea entirely independent. If you're wanting to kind of bring them back toward a thread, you can always find a way for that stuff to connect, even if it wasn't initially supposed to. And that's a really good way of adding a word that is kind of overused in this space, but adding some verisimilitude to what it is that you're creating, because then the players start to make those connections and go, oh gosh, this is all connected, and I wonder if this thing is connected to that thing. And it might be or it might not be, but that's going to continue to keep them engaged.
They don't need to know that.
Exactly. They don't need to know. They don't need to know any of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
That's all in your head.
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking off of that, and also what Daisy had said about specific details like and sensory things, I think there is a lot of value in, while maintaining an idea of what the world is like in your head, not necessarily dictating what things are until you need a moment, and you enter the city, and then the players are engaged, and so you can talk about the sights and the smells and the sounds. And you don't necessarily need to like have those all written out and pre-planned, because a lot of those happen in the moment where you walk into the tavern and someone asks, okay, well, what do I see? And you have more like, oh, you know what, actually, like here are some specific details that are gonna make this feel very real and very lived in, that don't have to be anything like super elaborate or pre-planned out, to still feel very real.
Yeah. Nice. Great answers, y'all. Thank you for your question. Let's
Thank
grab
you so
another
much.
one.
Thank you.
Hi. I would love to know what, in each of your respective opinions, is the most underrated element of world building that you don't see so much in other works that you really would like to?
Great question.
Food.
In case you didn't hear it, most underrated aspect of world building.
Food. There's a lot more of it now because a lot of people would probably at this point have that answer for you. So we're seeing it more in some of the bigger properties, but foods, spices, smells, those sorts of things are so intrinsically linked to so many of our experiences, our cultures, our history. Yeah, food.
This was actually brought up yesterday very briefly at the Decolonizing RPGs panel, and it was something that was so profound that like I made a note of it. So I'm just going to repeat it because I think it's better than anything else I could tell you. It's talking about decentralizing, specifically how male roles, specifically related to combat. Like when you think about most game systems, there's a whole lot about how do you fight, what abilities do you have to do combat, and not a whole lot about what is the world like, what is it experiencing it feel like. And I think those pieces are that's what makes the world feel real.
Oh gosh, I think, and this is kind of a personal preference as well, but I think it's holidays and celebrations. Honestly, that's something that you will read a lot about in various world Bibles, but don't necessarily come out in play a lot. And when you're creating your own world, I think it's very underrated how much richness can be involved in a holiday and a celebration. And not in the real world, like sometimes celebrations don't have a lot behind them, but sometimes they really, really do. Sometimes it goes all the way back, hundreds or even more years, and your world can do that as well. You can come up with, what is a festival? Why do they do it this way? Where does that come from? How has this evolved? What was the original practice? And that can really do a lot of the legwork for you for, telling you what the culture is like, what the local area is like. So, and plus, like I said, you need a cool event to get the players' attention. There's the festival. Why are they lighting all of those trees on fire? I don't know. Why don't you figure out what their history was?
That's where elves come from. For me, I would say time in the oven. The most underrated aspect is the time it takes. I think probably the richest setting that I've ever played in and examined is Aventuria by the company Ulysses Spiele, which is a German company. That setting has been around, I believe, for 47 years now. They have curated fan submissions where they say this is what happened in our campaign, and they have a living campaign setting, but they're almost 5 decades strong. So the fact that they've let it germinate, exist, they've collected the stories of the players, they've shared it over a very long period of time, they have built a fantastic setting. And it's not without its faults, but it's that time that they allow it to persist. Someone asked me, they said, where does Lauren Cannon even come from? I said, time, it's just, it takes time.
Great, thank you. Next question.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ram, he, him. So many of the settings that we encounter or build ourselves are usually during time periods of war, conflict, destruction, and I see generally a dearth of world building that's done during times of prosperity and peace. Do you think that there are still dramatic play opportunities where there is prosperity, and why don't we see more of that?
Great question.
I can't answer why you don't see as much more of it because I can only speak to the games and settings I design.
Sure.
But there's, I think it's all about finding the stories you want to tell and finding divorce setting from system and then also bring them back together. A setting like Golden Sky Stories where you are beautiful anime characters that are having very wholesome, heartwarming tales that have as much value as atrocities of war or terror of war. I think it's about introducing people to those experiences. And once they feel those experiences, then they might want to continue to persist those experiences. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think that's where I'll start and pass the baton.
Yeah, I think a lot of some of the bigger media, right, movies and television shows sort of rely on a lot of bang for the buck in terms of setting and conflict. And so we are oversaturated with settings that are in times of war and conflict and things like that. But the truth is these types of world building things, these types of games, these small collaborative storytelling sessions that we do are the perfect space for exactly what we just said, for those really lovely, smaller stories, right? It may be a time of prosperity, but you can find a small conflict that resolves and feels really nice for your table. I think it's a matter of scale and a matter of what we see. And the truth is, those types of things are smaller and maybe less, well, the truth is less lucrative, probably, for big media companies. I mean, So in terms of why, I think that has a lot to do with it. We just see everywhere else, it's sort of a...
Yeah, I think it's a lot easier when you're world building when there's already an ongoing conflict, because there are all of these built-in narrative devices for that, right? There's all these stories that can be told, all of the hardship that the characters may have overcome to get to the place that they're at, maybe what their goal is, can all fit inside this larger world conflict. But you absolutely don't have to do that, right? You can completely have a world where there have been a lot of hardships in the past, but they have resulted in this prosperity. And digging into what has happened in the past and thinking, where's the generational iteration coming from, and what would those characters be like after that, is a really interesting way to do that. I mean, we kind of see that in some post-apocalyptic settings, right? Where on the surface, it's fairly peaceful, but that's because there's actually a horror show going on outside that happened beforehand, and everything that was once before, it was obliterated. So there's a lot of richness that can be in that baseline from wherever you want to start.
Yeah, war is something that's very easy to dig into because we talk about conflict being a driver for narrative, and that's literal conflict. But one of my favorite level 1 adventures to run is, hey, the party is walking down the street and animals get loose in the pet shop. Because there's very low stakes, and honestly, there's something really delightful about trying to catch like a runaway cat in fantasy. And I think those are the stories that oftentimes build great memories too. And I agree with your point. I'd like to see more of it. I'm not sure what the best way to bring that in is, but I think those are the stories that really, they feel more human in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'm hearing scale seems to be, right? War feels this, right? But escaped pets is kind of small. And even in, as Eugenio said, the peaceful times, there's still conflict to be found depending on your scale.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Great. Let's grab another question.
Hi. With world building, you can go down a lot of rabbit holes, and there's a difficulty sometimes in trying to not be the completionist and give ideas time to gestate, because you're not going to be able to come up with all of them at once, and you need more time or some player input to reel yourself in. When you're building for a session, how do you tell yourself to stop world building?
Yeah, I love that.
It's 2 in the morning and I want to go to bed.
What kind of strategies do you have to tell yourself, put a pin in it, wait for later?
Part of it for me would depend on the game system that I'm running. Typically, if I'm prepping for, I'll use a game like Dungeons and Dragons. I only allow myself half as long as I'm going to run the session for to prep, and that's all I do. And I have a procedural list of questions that I ask myself. You can find the same list of questions in a book called Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, which I'm credited in. Shout out. One in any. That's what I do, and I say I've got to find, I'm only going to write 10 secrets about the world. What are 10 things about the world I can reveal? Where's it going to start? And then is there any potential treasures or encounters they're going to have? And then I look at those things. So if they're encountering, say, hobgoblins, well, what are hobgoblins in my world and how do they exist? But I only give myself a strict time period. So if it's a 4-hour session, 2 hours. 2-hour session, 1 hour. And I restrict myself to that. And it's how I've kind of kept good mental health.
I like that. That's very good.
Yeah, I do start out with that outline of the session, the plot points that I think the players are probably going to get to based on the information that they seem to be looking to have revealed to them. And then so I'm like, okay, I think that this is going to be the end. A lot of this comes from, I've run some online stream games, and it's, that's very tight and like, okay, the slot is only this long, and that you've got to get to this point because that's the cliffhanger that the episode is going to end on. And so like determining that kind of cliffhanger almost from a screenwriting perspective then lets me have a gap, right, in which I fill in what I think the players are going to need to know from a world building perspective. And then once I have that filled into my own satisfaction, it's like, okay, I can stop. And Daisy has a very good point. I tried not to go more than half or so of the prep time that I need for the session, but there have been sessions where there's been more than that. But also when you find yourself really enjoying it and you've got the time, like there's nothing wrong with that either.
I'm just going to repeat what they said. So it was an
Okay,
excellent
great, perfect.
question.
All right, great. Let's have another question. Thank you so much. What a great question.
Hi, thanks all very much for putting on this excellent panel. My question is about political structures. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you approach designing them, because I think that it's easy to kind of get lost in the details and create something that's novel and fun, but that doesn't always lend itself to good storytelling. And it's especially not always accessible to players if you've like accidentally created this Kafkaesque bureaucracy to your city. So like what are your thoughts on like how you should design political structures in your world?
Yeah.
I tend to adapt them from existing things, and there was an older iteration of Star Wars, the Weston Games version. In their Galaxy Guide on Scouts, they actually had a table you could roll on to just pull, and they'd give you a paragraph description and just a paragraph of basic political structures. Then on the other side of that coin, I have a bunch of friends who have degrees in political science. I just call them and say, what's some interesting political structures? And they're like, an adhocracy. That's where you appoint someone when you need them, at the moment you need them. Maybe your town could have an adhocracy. We need a fire marshal. You're the fire marshal today. So like, it's one of those things. So I either use a table and a short description, or I call someone who's really passionate about it and get that short description and try to keep it fun and punchy.
Yeah.
I just tend to kind of draw from real world analogs a lot of the times. I honestly, I'm a big fan of city-states because I don't like having to keep track of all the big, like, major political powers. But I think there's a lot of interest and intrigue that can come from just the inner workings in one city. Now, I have kingdoms and things like that, but I also like to try and imagine ways that the world could operate that maybe we haven't necessarily seen done well before in the real world too. I try to be optimistic and like a little bit utopian in that respect. Like maybe there's a little hope for humanity after all.
Yeah.
I would say, and it occurs to me that this is actually advice in terms of not sort of going down prep rabbit holes and world building rabbit holes as well, which is to know what your players are going to actually, PG-13?
Yes.
Give a shit about. You know, which is not to say don't create the structure for yourself, right? If you have fun with that and you want to create this new form of government with these offices and this hierarchy and whatever, that's great. But if your players are not the type who are, first of all, if they're not going to interact with it, right? If your story has nothing to do with it, well, then it's a kingdom. Next. But also, if your players aren't the type to sort of lean in and really need to or want to know that stuff, then you can sort of, and I know I keep saying this, and I guess I'm now learning a lot about my own style, you can add the finer points as they become relevant during the story, have an idea there. On the other hand, if your players are, you know that they're the type of players who are going to be like, all right, I need to know exactly who reports to whom so that I can get to the top of this political chain, whatever it is, then at least you have direction for where to start.
Yeah.
Okay, your players are interested in the chain of command. That's what I'm going to build first, and figure out what fun I can do with it once that's there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think thinking about what your players will actually interact with is going to serve you very well. And thinking about if you've got a player who's wanting to interact with the bureaucracy, or you've got a player whose father, you know, is a well-known politician or was at some point and is in disgrace, and they know everybody and they want to interact with all of that. Building that out is really going to serve your game well, because there will be all of these branching narratives that you may or may not choose to follow up on based on that interaction. But if you've got a party that's just in town and they're wanting to, you know, talk to the mayor to see if there's some money that can be had from getting rid of the threats of the goblins outside of town, you don't necessarily need that super complicated political structure. That's, in that case, I would save that for, you know, when they're in a spot that they would interact with it. Because, you know, it's all about pushing that game forward and having you and your players kind of push and pull to find out that information.
I had a GM tell me one time, you know, if your players want to do something, like say they want to talk to the town mayor, the entire political structure of the town, nobody says you have to have it prepared that day.
Yeah.
You can't get all the governmental officials in one room in a single session. Like that may be a next session thing, and now you know what to prep to. So you don't always have to tell you, like, fulfill your players' needs in the moment. Sometimes the wait, as you said, the like time can be really beneficial.
I've actually got a Pathfinder 2nd Edition adventure out there in which one of the events that kicks off things is there is actually a town meeting that you go to because there are adventurers who are needed, and all of the council members are there in that meeting, and that's where you can talk to them for that exact same reason.
So you can prep that. That takes time, you know? Yeah, for sure. Great question. Let's grab
Thanks
one
very
more.
much.
we got some time for maybe one or two more. Let's see how far we can get.
Howdy. My question is, if you feel confident in your world building in the micro and it's well received by your players, and when you're trying to transition that into something like a 25,000 page book, or basically to flesh out your setting in a much larger scale, if you run into issues like ADHD or other hurdles that you would come across in going from bullet points to long form, what are some ways to help that transition from creating your world in that style to fleshing it out heavier?
Great. Just in case everybody didn't hear the question, how to go from your home table game, which you've created together, to something that's more structured, like a 20,000 word book, or something that's more published.
I think. Go ahead.
Okay. What I would recommend is start writing and practice writing, and then ask someone who knows writing well to assess your writing and maybe suggest what you might need to work on. And if there is a, say I have all my siblings, I have 5 siblings, they're all artists, we all work professionally, and all 5 of them have ADHD, and there's writers, etc. But what they've done is they've asked each other, how did you get help with this so I could focus on, finishing the work that I start, because I want to get paid for my work and I want to support a family. I also would like my authorial voice to be out there. I have a story to tell and share, so I'd want it to be out there. And so what they do is they share resources with each other to help them through those struggles. And then as far as transitioning from bullet points to long form is, I would start writing, and then I would run samples by friends, and not necessarily friends, but people that know writing, and then get their advice on what it'll take to take it to the next step. Neil Gaiman gave 2 pieces of advice to anyone that wants to get started with writing books. He said, first, start things. Second piece of advice, finish things. And it's very, very hard if you're struggling, but that's why it's important to seek people who know where the resources are and be persistent until you get help to find those resources as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a mindset shift, right? I think it's like you said, you start starting out with those bullet points that you built for your game that you've run as the DM, and you've created things that you've needed for your players to flesh out that game. And I think going from that to actually writing for a book and creating a setting bible or a campaign setting book, it's about shifting the mindset from here's this very small, narrow set of story points that happened in the game to this larger, what do all DMs need to know if they're going to set a game in this world? What's the history of the place? What's the major structures? How's the government work? What are the major groups of people? Who are the big major named NPCs that are in bold with a little micro stat block in there? And shifting that mindset to providing tools rather than actually having the story points for yourself is going to get you a long way toward what Daisy had mentioned, which is getting that writing out there that's going to be usable by lots and lots of folks to create their own stories.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm certainly a big fan of bouncing ideas off of other people. I find that sometimes when I hit a dead end, right, I'm not sure where to go next, if I just chat with someone for a few minutes, another DM, someone who perhaps is also in the space writing, we can get past that block pretty easily just by spitballing for a few minutes. But also, I want to, just specifically on the topic of doing writing, I want to recommend Stephen King's book about writing. It's called On Writing. It's a very creative name. But he's got some brilliant advice in there. I read that a number of years back, and a lot of those pieces have really stuck with me and may be helpful as you're thinking about, okay, how do I take an idea and a story and actually put it word on the page?
Yeah. Great advice and great tools. Thank you so much. We are really close to time. I'm not sure we're going to have much more for a question, but I do want to let you all tell everybody where they can find you after PAX this weekend, or maybe here at PAX this weekend. Yeah, so let's just go down and let you introduce yourself one more time. Big round of applause for everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions.
So you can find me on Twitter at @awiseartist. If this panel was yesterday, I would name the bars you could have found me at. But you can catch me either at the 2C Gaming booth or wandering around. Every now and then I'm at the TPK tournament, but that's me.
Yes. I am everywhere and nowhere all at once at this convention. You can catch me hanging out with the Kobolds a lot over at their booth or just kind of in the halls here and there. But I'm largely on Twitter at Amanda Hamon, and I post all kinds of garbage. So if you follow me, even worse.
Yeah, you can find me on all social media platforms at Joshua M. Simons, except for MySpace. That's what the M stands for, is except for MySpace. But I also stream on Twitch, on my Twitch channel. It's twitch.tv/Joshua Simons. The M is missing because it's not MySpace.
And you can find me on Twitter and Twitch. I do some streaming on my channel as well at DM Jazzy Hands. We just wrapped season 11 of Rivals of Waterdeep, so we'll be back at the end of January, but you can catch us on Sundays. I'll be stepping back into the player role there. We're working on the Into the Motherlands thing. We'll let you all know if we're going to be having more seasons of that show. You'll find that on my Twitter. And then you can find my podcast, The Last Refuge, wherever podcasts are free, as Celeste Conowitch says. You can find us on Twitter at DND Last Refuge. And in fact, this coming Wednesday is the finale of a little partnership between The Last Refuge and Kobold Press, and a really cool 8-bit virtual tabletop called One More Multiverse. We have been exploring the Northlands of Midgard, and it seems that
Speaking
Loki...
of world building.
Speaking of world building.
Yeah.
And we've been exploring the Northlands and trying to stop Loki from bringing about Ragnarok. So you can come hang out with us on Wednesday evening at twitch.tv/Kobold Press.
That's it. Y'all, I'm Dot. I'm the Kobold Press producer, Twitch producer, so thank you for being here. I want to encourage you, if you have more questions, these people may be around, so you might be able to hit them up. But Kobold Press actually has a book called Guide to World Building, and it's available right now at our booth, 3131. Great essays about a lot of what we're talking about, some more in-depth view of things like pantheon structures, city-states, and the works, including essays by Wolfgang Bauer himself. So drop by, you can grab that and see if that doesn't answer additional questions and become a good guide to helping you continue fantastic world building for your tables. Everybody, enjoy the rest of your PAX Unplugged 2021 and have safe travels home.